Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 17, Section 5, and it's called Wilson's New Freedom. And as we talk about Woodrow Wilson, very fascinating president, personally one of my favorites. I know I said that with Teddy Roosevelt, but I think Wilson is amazing for a lot of reasons. He sought to establish a strong reform agenda as a very progressive leader. And I want to give you a little background of Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was raised in a very strict conservative Christian family. He grew up as a Presbyterian. He went on to become a lawyer, was an academic, went on to teach history, in fact, in politics and political science, and decided to get his PhD and become a professor. This man was extremely motivated. Not only did he become a professor, but he was so successful as a teacher and as a university professor that he went on to become president of Princeton University. That is an honor and distinction in itself, and most people would never aspire to anything beyond being the president of one of our most prestigious universities. But Woodrow Wilson was a very ambitious person, and he was also very motivated. And he went on to run for the governor of New Jersey. Now, as governor of New Jersey, this put him in a unique position to consider the nomination for the Democratic candidacy for President of the United States. And we talked about all the drama of 1912 and how the division in the Republican Party paved the way for a Democratic president in 1912. And when he was elected president, he pursued a very similar agenda to what the Republican president Teddy Roosevelt had. And remember, the parties kind of flip-flopped in 1912, where the Republicans had been the progressives. I mean, think 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, three of the most progressive amendments in American history. But after 1912, because really, Taft has the distinction of, betraying his predecessor's agenda, and so many of the progressives kind of turned against the Republican Party. And so if you've ever wondered, if you engage in political arguments or if you read about politics, why did the parties flip-flop? Because, here we have Abraham Lincoln, arguably one of the more progressive presidents in American history. So the Republican Party had always been about advancing the cause of civil rights. If you remember, the Civil Rights Act of 1868, 100 years before its time, was pushed through with Republican support. So what was going on there? 1912 explains a lot. And the Democratic Party became the party of progressivism after that time. And so Roosevelt focused on, ironically, many of the very same goals that the Republican Party under Roosevelt had been focusing on, namely monopolies, tariffs. Remember, taxes on imports were allowing monopolies to form and function free of international trade. And then finally, high finance, reforming the banking industry. And so there are a lot of parallels between what Wilson was seeking to tackle and what we've been discussing in the 2016 election as well. Two of the key measures that Wilson pursued were, number one, monopolies. The Sherman Antitrust Act was a landmark piece of legislation in that it outlawed monopolies. However, many monopolies had found loopholes in this law and had continued to function. And remember, Teddy Roosevelt, the Republican, made it his passionate goal to pursue monopolies. And Wilson took that a step further by saying these monopolies are evil and they are hurting not only American trade, but they are hurting the American worker and consumer. And so he pushed through the Clayton Antitrust Act. And this stopped companies from buying up enormous stocks that still exist today to form monopolies. It also protected workers' rights to go on strike by outlawing injunctions. Injunctions were special orders that companies could pass against strikers, which would allow for the National Guard to come in and dispel striking workers. And what Wilson did was protect workers' rights to strike unless they threatened irreparable damage, like physical destruction. And remember when we talked about the labor movement several chapters ago, we also learned how occasionally these strikes and protests would become violent because the National Guard would be called in, because companies would use injunctions, and injunctions mean troops come in, and these workers had no resort except to turn to violence. But again, one of the next big measures adopted by Wilson was the Federal Trade Commission. This is a new watchdog agency. It was set up to investigate regulatory violations and to end unfair business practices. Because you see, it's one thing to have a law, but if you have a law that you know will be contentious, there must be a measure of enforcement, and that's where the Federal Trade Commission comes in. Wilson also pushed through the Underwood Act. This would substantially reduce tariffs. Because remember, tariffs represent a threat to international trade. They were originally intended to protect American industries, and tariffs date back to the earliest parts of American history. But when monopolies were forming, and when companies were unable to compete with firms like Standard Oil or U.S. Steel, I mean, there was no competing with U.S. Steel or Standard Oil or Chase Bank. These companies were so powerful, they controlled their respective industries. And so who is going to compete? How do we have competition? Because isn't competition the hallmark of capitalism? And so that's why reducing tariffs allowed foreign companies to compete with U.S. Steel or Standard Oil. And so the Underwood Act was meant to reduce tariffs so that these foreign companies had a chance to compete with U.S. Steel or Standard Oil. He also set the precedent of giving the State of the Union address in person instead of in a written statement. And Wilson was also well known for using his bully pulpit to get laws passed. All right, so one of the big successes, and it's odd to say that a tax is a success, but the 16th Amendment, ratified to the Constitution during Wilson's tenure, signed by President Wilson, legalized a graduated federal income tax. You see, the system of taxation had always been a messy one. The government has to collect revenue, but how do they do it? And this established by constitutional law a federal income tax. But it means a progressive income tax in the sense that poor families don't have to pay as much taxes as wealthy families. When you start working, you're going to fill out a form called a 1040 EZ. And that form, as a young person, when you fill that out, that means you're going to get all of your taxes back because you're not earning enough income to have to pay taxes yet at this point. And I filled out that form for probably my first 10 years as a worker in the United States. And then, of course, when I got my teaching job, I got paid a little more, and I have to fill out a different form now. And I do pay taxes, which is a chunk. But even though about a third of my income goes to taxes, I respect the intention of this, and I respect the fact that families like my sisters, who only have one person working with 4 kids, they shouldn't have to pay. They just shouldn't. They don't make enough to have to pay to the same degree that my wife and I do, who are both working with no kids. Next, the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve System established a private banking system under federal control. And what this did, and continues to do today, is monitor our financial system. It is the Federal Reserve that issues currency. All of your dollar bills say Federal Reserve note. And so now United States currency is protected and backed and managed very carefully by this group. If you remember Andrew Jackson, you may remember him saying, the Bank of the United States is trying to kill me, I will kill it. That was one of his huge agendas as president, was killing the Bank of the United States. He caused, almost single-handedly, the Panic of 1828. By collapsing the Bank of the United States, he disrupted the economy and caused a depression. Wilson has fixed that in a big way with the
Prohibition and populist parties, for example, originally advocated our 19th Amendment to the Constitution, giving women the right to vote. And in 1920, the Women's Suffrage Amendment was ratified.
As if I haven't suffered enough.
What?
I said getting that amendment passed must have been tough.
It was. You see, Harlan, suffrage means the right to vote. But for the first 144 years of this country's existence, women couldn't vote. In 1848, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton organized the first women's rights convention in America. She and Susan B. Anthony joined forces, campaigning tirelessly year after year for women's suffrage. Beginning in 1878, an amendment to give women that right was introduced in Congress and promptly defeated. But finally, in 1918, Jeannette Rankin, the first Congresswoman, proposed the amendment again. Although it barely passed the House of Representatives by the required two-thirds vote, the amendment was ratified by two-thirds of the Senate and three-fourths of the states, and women finally got to vote.
And about time. Talk about unfair.
I agree. Unfortunately, the right to vote was once a privilege only given to white men wealthy enough to own land. But amendments like 15th, stating that the right to vote cannot be denied because of race, color, or previous condition of slavery, and the 19th, granting suffrage to women, have given all citizens
18 and older
the right to vote.
And so I wanted to use that little clip to segue into the women's suffrage movement. Because after all, it was Woodrow Wilson who signed the 19th Amendment into law. The 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote. And we've been learning for quite some time, since Chapter 8, about how women had been working for the right to vote, ever since the Seneca Falls Convention, when it became the national goal of the women's rights movement. Women had been working to spread the message and spread the importance of the vote to everyone. This is called a grassroots movement, where we need to get everyone, poor, rich, educated, not, etc., working class, wealthy, everyone needs to get on board with the movement to give women the right to vote. And how did they do this? Well, women and men worked together, going door to door, taking trolley tours, meaning using public transit and taking every opportunity to bug people and talk about their message and convince others and give speeches. You know, for example, regardless of how you felt about the election, if you were involved and if you felt strongly about either candidate, or if you felt very passionate about the election in some way, then don't just turn off that part of you. Don't just stop talking about it. Get involved. There are organizations on both sides of the political spectrum continuing the work that was begun in this election. You know, and I do promise to keep my own partisan politics out of this class. But I do want to let you know I plan to become politically involved. I plan to be more involved even than I have previously. And I do plan on volunteering with political parties and organizations. And I do plan on contributing to, in my own small way, to groups that are working to advance the causes that I believe strongly in. And I already have in some degree, and I have for a long time. But I want to do more. I want to be involved in our community, in our society, because as a citizen, I believe That is my responsibility as part of being a good citizen. And no matter what you believe, I think you should. Because if you believe strongly in whatever it is, don't just vote and leave it at that. Don't just say, oh, so-and-so will do that for me. Well, that is how a representative democracy works to some degree. But that's not all of it, because it takes concerned, caring individuals. And that's what these suffragettes, that's what they were called, the women getting the right to vote, suffragettes. That's what they did. You see, they wanted the right to vote. But they weren't just waiting for Carly to take care of it for us. No, they were going door to door. They were traveling. They were giving speeches. They were marching. I mean, there's a women's rights march on Washington coming up in the next couple of months. The movement's not over. And there will be possibly over 1 million women marching on Washington. And if that's a movement you believe in, go. We'll figure out school later. Be a part of it. Be a part of something bigger than yourself. Now, hopefully it's not around final exam season, but anyway. Maybe they'll time it around your Christmas break, but who knows? Yeah. Now, I want to talk about some heroes in this movement. Carrie Chapman Cat, who you're going to see played by Hilary Swank in this next clip. She was the head of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. She strongly believed in organization. You know, it's one thing to express your concern or your delight about a recent election or express your political beliefs. That's certainly an important and valuable part of our society. But where you really get things done is joining groups of like-minded people, that organization. That's how Carrie Chapman Cat was able to get this done. You know, it's the old saying I keep repeating throughout this course: stop complaining, start a revolution. Or join an existing one, because there's probably already one going on. The National Women's Party began to aggressively pressure for the suffrage amendment. Eventually, the First World War, which we'll get into in U.S. too, is going to pave the way for suffrage. Because when the First World War broke out in 1914, women, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, National Association of Colored Women, all of these groups saw it as an opportunity to gain public support for their movement. And so all of these women's groups strongly encouraged women to get involved in the war. And now, of course, women weren't involved in combat roles at this time. But with the encouragement of these organizations, women were involved in every other facet of the war. They gave of financially. They worked in war-related industries, freeing up jobs for men to go fight. They served as nurses, as laundresses, as cooks, as drivers, as secretaries, everything you can imagine. And these organizations were encouraging women to get out and to support the war. And you know what that did? That bought the political capital that gained the public favor for the movement. And in 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed, granting women the right to vote. Some of these women even took the movement so far as to adopt very bold tactics of civil disobedience. As I said, Susan B. Anthony was arrested over 100 times for voting illegally. I mean, that takes passion, right? That takes perseverance. That takes a willingness to challenge the status quo. But that takes guts. Get yourself thrown in prison over 100 years. Ladies, this woman was arrested over 100 times so that you can vote in our next election. That should be a challenge to you. And young men, I mean, of course the same, right? People died for your right to vote. And you know what? I'm disgusted and disheartened to learn that once again, less than half of Americans voted. You know, and I don't care what you believe. That's your right to choose and your responsibility to choose carefully. But it is your civic duty to vote. I'll leave it at that. Now, from 1912 forward, the Democratic Party became the party of progressivism. And as a presidential candidate, Woodrow Wilson had won the support of the NAACP for being outspoken in favor of the civil rights movement for African Americans. As president, however, he opposed laws to put an end to lynching. Maybe you remember Sojourner Truth. Maybe you've done a project about her. This amazing lady, you know her from the speech, "Ain't I a Woman?" And she made it her passionate goal throughout her career and her life to pursue an end to lynching. Lynching is an extrajudicial killing by a mob of people. It means angry mob rounding up bad guy and hanging them. The trouble with that is that's vigilante justice. If you watch your superhero stuff, you know there are often themes in comics that vigilantes are a bad thing. Of course, that's what the Batman series was all about. That's what the recent Superman movie was all about. The vigilantes, while they look cool in the comics, are actually kind of scary and a threat to democracy, because our judicial system is based on the principle of innocent until proven guilty. And the burden of proof lies on the prosecution, not the defender. It works out. It should work that way. It is meant to work that way. And yes, that means we let some bad guys go from time to time. But that is our constitutional system. That is the basis of our democratic justice system. Vigilantes represent a threat to that. And what we have seen historically is that lynching targets minorities. Most people lynched in American history were black. And there was no law against lynching until the early 1950s. And so I have to balance praise with criticism. Woodrow Wilson understood that for him to be outspoken against lynching, if he really goes there, he'll lose the support of white Southerners. Because I have to be honest, and have to think about our own territory. You see, FDR didn't touch it. Wilson didn't touch this cause. Every Democratic politician knew that to be outspoken for civil rights would be political suicide, would hurt the movement, is how they saw it. Harry Truman, he went there. Harry Truman went there. And he used his executive power to integrate the armed forces. And he, not only as a candidate, but as a president, became outspoken in civil rights. And guess what? Solid South blue turned into solid South red from that point forward. It was a trend that began in 1912 and was finalized in 1948, where Democrats turned Republican as the parties flipped. Wilson knew that would happen if he took those steps as president. In fact, he appointed other white Southerners to the cabinet who extended segregation. So he appointed white supremacists to his cabinet. And the NAACP felt betrayed. And as Wilson defended himself in this cause by saying, no, the progressive movement will die if I become outspoken on civil rights, it doesn't change the fact that he betrayed the NAACP. You know, for example, in this election, I want to tell you how far I went. I don't know about you, but I've read the case files of Roe v. Wade. That's where I went, because so many people vote in an election about abortion. And for many, it's that simple. And I'm not going into that debate, and I'm not opening that can of worms. But I was concerned, and I was interested, and I was like, okay, just to be fair, I want to read what exactly is Roe v. Wade that it needs to be overturned. Ruth Ginsburg, one of the Supreme Court justices who was on the bench and still is, but she was on the bench in 1979 when Roe v. Wade was passed. She has written later that she regrets that this issue has become so political. Because for many, including my family, it's just that simple. And Wilson, also understood, and certainly Truman understood, that when they made it about civil rights, but this is the end of our chapter on progressivism for now. We'll revisit this topic at a later date. Because when the First World War broke out, war changes things. You see, when a war breaks out, social causes get put on the back burner. Johnson's War on Poverty was put on the back burner when the Vietnam War broke out. The New Deal was effectively ended by the Second World War, and so on and so forth.